Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar, Implementing a Test Automation Framework. My name is Brent Jenkins, Marketing Manager here at Checkpoint Technologies, and I'll be your moderator. Joining me today is our presenter, Dean Carvin, Director of Professional Services. Dean, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Will do, Brent. Thank you. So my name is Dean Carvin. I've been in the QA field for about 16 years now. Started my career actually in test automation. Worked with Test Director back in the day, now Quality Center ALM. Started with Windrunner back in the day and moved on to Quick Test Pro and UFT. Love the field, love the process, enjoy working with the tools, and test automation. Developing frameworks is my passion, and thoroughly enjoy it. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dean. Just a little bit about Checkpoint Technologies before we get started. We started in January of 2003. That's when we incorporated, and our headquarters is located in sunny Tampa, Florida. Our area of expertise is all around the quality assurance and quality control areas, specifically when it comes to functional, performance, and application security testing. We are a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Gold Partner, authorized software support partner, and an HPE certified training partner. We're also proud to be partners with Zephyr, Mobile Labs, and Turnkey Solutions, who all make leading-edge solutions to address software testing challenges. Along with that, we are also affiliated with QAI Worldwide. QAI, if you don't know, stands for Quality Assurance Institute, and if you ever need training courses on things like the essentials in software testing or boot camp for business analysts, we can certainly provide that to you right here in our Tampa Training Center. Speaking of QAI Worldwide, if you aren't familiar with their annual conference Quest, it's an incredible conference filled with classes, workshops, a world-class expo, and more. Our president, Bob Cruz, will be teaching a 2-day course there. We'll actually be in booth number 4 at the expo, so come see us. And actually, this webinar is based off of a half-day tutorial Dean will be given there. I highly suggest you check it out, which is in Chicago next month, the 18th to the 22nd. For more information on that, just visit qaiquest.org/2016. As far as some of the services we at Checkpoint Technologies provide to companies all around the United States, they include staff augmentation. So if you need some strong testing resources to be part of your team, long or short term, whether on-site or remote, we can provide that to you. We also provide consulting, so anything from handling upgrades, installation, configuration, and customization for different solutions. Next is our version of offshoring, where we can house a team for you right here in our 7,800 square foot headquarters in Tampa, Florida, I mentioned earlier. We also provide education, structured classroom training, or tailored mentoring, where we will go on site in your environment and educate your team how to use a solution where real work gets done. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This is a live webinar, but it is being recorded, so everyone who has registered and joined will receive a link to that recording within 24 hours. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but we do encourage you to ask any questions that you can at any point in time during the webinar. We will be trying to answer some of them even throughout the webinar. So please, we really encourage you to participate by asking questions. Just so you know, everybody should see their control panel. We're using GoToWebinar. So right there, there's the questions panel. Just type your question in, hit send, and hopefully we'll get to it. If we don't get to your question on this webinar, we will be following up in a couple of weeks with answers to all the questions asked. I do want to mention and remind everyone of some of the key takeaways you should get from this webinar, which are identify the different types of automation frameworks, learn to develop an automation strategy, help determine the type of framework to implement, top challenges when implementing a framework. So actually, before I pass the presentation off to Dean, I thought it'd be interesting to do a quick poll and see where everyone in the audience's organization currently stands with their test automation. So if you don't mind, I would like everybody to participate in this poll, which is, what is the current state of the test automation at your organization? Is it non-existent and no immediate plan to implement, non-existent but working on an implementation plan, under construction, existing but no framework in place, or mature with a successful framework in place? I'm going to give the audience just a couple of more seconds to take the poll so we can get as best results as we can. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Thank you, everybody who participated. Dean, I'm going to hand it off to you now to talk about your thoughts on the results of the poll and to kick off the presentation. So go ahead and take it away for me.
Thanks, Brett. Really appreciate that. So it's actually really encouraging, honestly. Only 3% of the attendees don't have any automation in place. The highest percentage is actually mature with a successful framework that's been implemented. And in between, we have 15% non-existent, but working on an implementation. So you have automation in mind, which is great. 29% is under construction. So maybe you have a little flexibility to hopefully employ some of the techniques we talked about in the webinar today. Then certainly there's a 21% that have an existing automation in place, but really it's not defined as a framework. Okay. So those are honestly, they're really encouraging. That's a long ways from even just a few years ago, what I would expect. So I really appreciate everyone participating in that poll. So let's get started here. Now, before we move on to really kind of the meat of everything, I just want to get everybody up to speed on frameworks. What is a framework? It's a term that's been used quite a bit in the industry, and it's really been thrown around a lot. I've seen things that people call frameworks, and they're really not a framework. So let's kind of clear that air first of all. So what are some of the characteristics of a true framework? All right, so the first two kind of go together, the points are modular and reusable. So you want to make sure that you are not duplicating your effort. So say you're using a process kind of a framework that we'll talk about in a minute. So you want to automate all the different processes in your application. You shouldn't have more than one login action that works for that process. You shouldn't have more than one create customer code that touches that screen that handles the process in the application that handles creating a customer. Make it very, very modular and reusable. Okay. Error handling is critically important. And by error handling, I mean unexpected events. What could possibly occur during the execution? Typically a classic scenario is some random pop-up message that could occur based on some piece of data coming through that you didn't really expect to have in there. All those things need to be handled because there's nothing worse than running a bunch of automation at night or hours during the day, not really watching it, but then you look back and it stopped on test number 3 where you have 303 tests to run, but something blew up and the test can't continue on, everything just freezes. So error handling is critical. And overall low maintenance, all those come together, those top 3 come together for low maintenance. And that's key. If you've tried automation and have failed, typically it's because of maintenance issues. It becomes more of a maintenance project than an automation project, and you can't make any headway on it. So modularity, reusability, error handling will help in that low maintenance. Framework should be application independent. In other words, the framework that you develop should be able to work with any application, any technologies that are being utilized at your organization for the applications that are in scope for testing. The framework should really be application agnostic, okay? And parallel script development. This is critical, and because it can take a while to develop a framework. All right, it's a lot of scripting, a lot of code, a lot of structure to put together. But the scripts themselves, the automated scripts themselves, should be able to be developed while the back end, while the framework itself is being developed. All right, and that's a key characteristic because it'll speed up development, speed up your ROI in your framework. So let's take a look at, again, just a real quick focus on modularity. And I put this in here to focus on because it is absolutely key. Without modularity, whether or not you're using a framework or not a framework, modularity in automation is critical for having a successful automation project. All right, so breaking out the common tasks in whatever level you need to do, and making sure that code, there's a one-stop shop to modify a process if it changes in your application. All right. And also, I want to look at a couple definitions because I'm going to be referring to some terms. I want to make sure everybody understands, so I don't have to kind of keep saying the definition. So there's a couple parts to a framework. There's a front end in general and a back end to a framework. So the front end is simply the interface and the format in which the automated scripts are actually written. So very often this can be in Excel or in a database. It could be in a test management tool. Somehow that's being utilized to develop your automated scripts actually. And that is separate from the back end. And the back end is the working part of the framework. And that contains the executable code. And that code depends on, of course, what automation tool your organization is using. But those are separate pieces. You got the back end that supports the front end design. We'll talk about that in detail in a little bit. And then you have the script designer. And I refer to these individuals as the customer, taken from an engineer's perspective. Okay, so if I'm the guy developing this back-end framework, I'm developing it for use by some script designers, and they are my customer. And those are the individuals that create the automated scripts. So we need to understand their capabilities, their comfort level when it comes to technical things, understanding the application of the test. So the script designer has to be part of the task of designing that front end. And again, we'll get into that. So those are the basic definitions that I'll keep referring to during the webinar. So if you were to look online and Google automation framework types, you would get a conglomerate of many, many, many opinions, many different terms. I've seen lists of 15 to 20 types of frameworks. I'm a simple kind of guy. There's 4 basic types of frameworks, and any other detailed framework or terminology could 99.9% of the time could be categorized under what you see on the screen right now. So there's business process or functional decomposition. So if you have a tool like HPALM, it actually supports a process called business process testing. And what that simply does is you break up your application into its functional components. So you actually have to do a study on the application. You may have a great set of requirements you can do this with, or the application may be already developed. So you can look at the application and say, what does it do? What are the pieces of the application? So they generally would start with a verb. All right, create a customer, modify an account, get an insurance quote, something like that. Those are business processes. You go through this functional decomposition, and then you come up with what processes have to be automated. Okay. Data-driven has been around forever as well, and this is more than just here's my script and I'm running multiple sets of data through this one script. All right, that is a data-driven script. That's not a data-driven framework, okay? We'll get into more detail exactly what a data-driven framework is. The other one is keyword-driven, right? And that's typically more granular than a business process. However, a business process called login or create account or whatever can be a keyword that does something, but keyword-driven is typically more granular than that. It's more on an object class basis and that level of granularity. And we'll look at that as well. So, and then there's hybrid. A hybrid is simply a combination of the above 3. And typically it's hard to find a framework, in my experience, in our experience at Checkpoint, that really fits into one of these categories and is purely a data-driven or keyword-driven or process or business process-driven framework. So typically you're going to end up with some sort of hybrid framework technology at your organization. So let's take a look at the business process or functional decomposition framework. So I mentioned HPALM, and it has a built-in business process testing called BBT. If you don't have that, this can be developed outside of any test management tool. You can create a framework that does sort of the same thing. It's challenging, but it can be done. So it involves creating a modular process-specific script for each business process. So the script is, in UFT terms, it's an action. In other tools, it's a function or a function library containing multiple functions, each function replicating a business process in your application. So some examples on the right-hand side. Again, they all begin with verbs: login, create, update, get, whatever your application does. And that's kind of the first thing you have to go through. Look at your application, talk to the BAs. If you're not familiar with it, talk to the BAs, talk to the manual testers, and document what does it do. So some of the advantages, it doesn't require a lot of automation expertise to put something like this together, because if your tool supports a recording mechanism, you can actually record each of those business processes, and there you have your baseline for that process in your automation tool. And then you simply want to go in and parameterize all the input, go in and make sure any outputs are accounted for. So an output would be my application creates a customer number. I'm going to capture that and hold that data and send it out somewhere. Capture that for posterity for my test results. It's also, the automated test can also be created easily, because the front end should be designed in such a way that a manual tester currently working on this project can create automated tests just by understanding the front end and a little bit of syntax, possibly, things like that. We talked about maintenance before. So in this case, you only have one set of code for each process. That lowers maintenance. So if you have a particular process, Z, that's being used in 25 tests, process Z changes, you need to update your code to fix that. You make the change in one place, and it updates all those tests. Now, maybe some of those tests need to be modified. They need to use that or work with that new functionality or new object, whatever. Typically, it may have two of them that have to be touched. But as far as the code base, one change, one point of maintenance. Some of the challenges, it does require some careful planning. You have to know where one process starts and where one ends. So you have an initial condition and an end condition for your processes, and you don't want to overlap, right? And the other point is, another challenge is you can get into the weeds. And we recently worked on a project where the application was incredibly complex. And it was virtually impossible to document everything that it did. I bet it would be impossible, honestly, because some of it was up to a matter of opinion. So we went so far to break out the high level or the most common processes, and then we started the framework, building out this business process framework. And then as we ran across other pop-up windows, a lot of drill downs, things like that, we added them to the framework. But it's easy to get into the weeds. It's easy to know, okay, we need to cut this. Let's start developing. Let's get this thing rolling. So the objective, of course, is to test. That's what we want to do. So let's look at a data-driven framework. So some of the unique characteristics are the code is separate from the data, and the code and the data is maintained in external files. So typically those files are like Excel, something that everybody understands, everybody uses in their business, day-to-day work in a lot of cases. Data is separate from the code. It's organized to correspond with the modular code design. So the structure of the front end, where that data is placed, is supported by the back end. All right, so that has to be kept in mind. But the key here is the data makes the decisions in the script direction. So based on the data input, calls are made to specific functions based on that data. different modules for processes, things, whatever it happens to be. Data, you got to think, data can be in any form, and we'll look at those in just a minute. But the idea here is you have one driver script, a framework, and it's one big piece of code all working together. The thing that changes the direction of the script is simply the data that runs through it. All right, same code, different sets of data, different interaction with the application, different output. Some of the advantages, it's a quick script design. So what I mean is that front end, it should be pretty simple. So it's simply by understanding a little bit of syntax and putting data in the right places, you can create an automated test. And if that's the case, then you can easily train manual testers to create scripts, okay? Challenges, again, requires detailed planning. Yeah, you can put this in every framework really, but this is even a little more challenging simply because you have to think about what kind of data can be going through. There's positive data, there's negative data. What if somebody screws up and puts completely wrong data in there or misses some required data for a certain process? So you have to account for all those variations and build those into your backend framework. And that's what I just mentioned. So the code design has to support the varying data. You may not know what's coming through, so you have to kind of account for many, many variations. All right. So here's a simple design structure for data-driven framework. You're going to have a driver script that is pretty complex. Typically has to make a lot of decisions. It grabs the input from a certain file. The input contain input parameters or values for input parameters. It can contain expected data. You can have something there called decision parameters, and we'll take a look at those in just a minute as well. So you're not relegated to just, here's the input into the objects in my application, here's what I expect. You can make decisions based on the types of data that you throw in there as well. So based on that data input, the driver script will call module 1, module 2, module whatever, in whatever order needs to be called based on that data input. In the end, you take that input file and now contains output data as well. If in case your application, this particular process, creates some output data, you want to capture that, write that out to the data table. Now you have as a record, here's the input we had for this test, and here's the output that it generated. And then that can even be verified via the database testing or manual tester, taking that and checking out, looking at it. And of course, results. And we'll talk about these pieces in more detail in just a bit. That's a data-driven framework. Keyword-driven, some of the characteristics, again, it separates the programming work from the actual test scripts. So the back-end programming work, front-end, the actual test scripts. They're represented as sets of keywords. So these can be very granular, whereas a process-driven is typically the name of a process. A keyword can be very granular. A keyword can be select. In other words, I'm selecting this item from a list box. I'm setting this value in the edit field. I'm getting this value, or I can get a value from this cell in a table. Right, so those are typically keywords, much more granular than a business process architecture. All right. And then the data is typically put in the data tables, represented, and part of the data table are keywords. So you have keywords, possibly the object. The keyword needs data, typically. A click wouldn't need data, but a set or select or whatever needs some set of data. So that will be included in there as well. And what's really cool about this is the functionality application now can be looked at and read via this automated test that has keywords in it, the keyword script in Excel. So even a manual tester can look at that and manually execute it, self-documenting, which is kind of neat. Some of the advantages, it is easy script developing, just as data framework should be. So simply by understanding some of the keywords, it may require a little more technical skills, understanding what methods, keywords, things like that are available for what types of objects, but a manual tester should be able to create those scripts. All right, it's self-documenting. And the other cool thing about a keyword-driven, scripts can be built without completing the code itself. Actually, what I should say here, scripts can be executed without completing all the code necessarily. All right, so it depends on what area of the application you're running. But script development can be worked on in parallel, but depending on the script itself, some of them can be run without the entire framework being completed. And the other thing is, it's typically easier and quicker to onboard new projects. So say you focus on a pilot project for your initial framework development design and using keyword-driven methodology. You're not focused on the application. You're focused on the objects. What classes of objects? How can we interact with these objects? If you have another, say there's some .NET application, you have another .NET application that's in queue for automation. What you develop in those keywords can be utilized for both applications, same technologies. All right. So you're developing these keywords for the project at hand, for the pilot. You're actually developing a framework that works with any technologies of that same kind. So onboarding a new project is very, very simple. Challenges, it takes a high level of proficiency. In other words, understanding logic, understanding the automation tool that you're utilizing, okay? Longer development stage, it tends to be much more technical in nature, accounting for all the variations. So those are some of the advantages and challenges. So this looks familiar, right? Keyword-driven framework structure. Like I said, I'm a simple guy. I can make this really complicated, but typically it's the same idea. You're going to have a driver script that feeds input. In this case, the input contains keywords along with the data. And instead of large modules that you're calling, these are going to be individual functions executing one step at a time, basically, against the application under test. And then you again have output data and results. So again, if you look online, you can find very complex models. This is a simple model. It works for us. We utilize it all over the place, and it fits well. So here's an example of a keyword-driven script. Okay, this is the actual script. It's in Excel. So there's just a handful of columns, a little bit of syntax, and you can see here how, with a little technical knowledge, a manual tester or a VA it doesn't really have any technical knowledge can be brought up to speed on how to develop an automated test using this method. So simply in this case, you have the class of the object, the object name as it appears on the application, and then the action is the keyword in this case. So we can import, okay, the file, we can invoke the application, set values, click buttons, verify the value in that particular web page, select, we also in this case we had a get that would grab the information in that object during runtime and write it out to the value column. All right. So this is just an example. I mean, if you look at any framework, any so-called keyword-driven framework, there are no two alike. Okay. This is an example that we've used in the past, and we can show more. But this is kind of a classic example of a keyword-driven, more granular framework. So
hey,
how
Dean,
about, yes.
Before you move on to the hybrid framework, I've got a question that actually came in that I thought would be pretty relevant for right now. It's, if I want non-developers to create and maintain scripts, would data-driven framework be the best option?
I personally don't think so, and here's why, and I'll show an example in a bit as well. But it's, in my opinion, it's easier to do a business process-driven framework, maybe like a hybrid of two combined. I'm going to show you an example in just a minute of a hybrid between a process-driven and data-driven. So those processes are predefined in the code, but then the data drives what objects in each of those processes is touched on and how they're interacted with. So that's a great example. And again, it depends on, we'll get into this a little bit too, but the simpler you create the back end or the front end, the more complex the back end is. But you can see here, this classic keyword driven is a bit more technical, not overly technical, but a bit more technical. Has a little syntax in it. And for instance, line 13 there, where customer ID has those two carets, that's referencing another tab in that sheet that has a value to put in there. So little things like that you can build into structure. But the simpler the better. Process driven, I think as far as technical and allowing manual testers to develop test scripts or automated scripts is probably the simplest. Good question.
Great, thanks, Dean.
Thank you, Brent. So let's look at a hybrid. What are the characteristics? Well, it depends, right? It depends on what other frameworks you combine into your hybrid framework. So that's simple. So and that's all going to depend on your environment, your team composition, skill sets, what your objective is, how quickly you have to develop your framework, things like that. And we'll take a look at that in just a minute as well, on how do you make a decision on what type of framework to develop. Again, advantages, disadvantages, or challenges, they take on the characteristics, advantages, and disadvantages of the frameworks that are being utilized. All right. They can be more complex to develop and maintain if you're not careful. Again, planning is really key, and as you're planning your framework, you always have to have in mind maintainability. All right. And the other thing that's always important to have in mind is understanding that you may not be the person forever on this project. It may be handed off to some other team or somebody. You may move on and get promoted. So now you have someone else has to come behind you and maintain this thing, however you want to define it. So kind of keep that in mind too. The structure, again, depends. All right, so here's an example of a hybrid framework script. And this is a combination of business process and data driven. So this is something that we've implemented at multiple clients, and it's worked really well. And it works really well because, going back to the question, it's very simple for manual testers to understand the structure, understand some rules behind it, a little syntax, and be able to develop automated tests. The first place we implemented this framework type, after it was ready to go, we tested it out, had it working on a couple different applications. We brought 8 or 10 manual testers into a conference room for a couple hours, and just to show them, here's how it works. Here's how you design automated tests. And after the first hour, most of them were developing automated tests using this format. They had no idea about the tool being used. They don't care. They didn't care about UFT or Selenium or whatever it was that was being used in the background. All they needed to focus on this front end, Excel. I know Excel. I understand some rules. I can learn. I can think abstractly to kind of apply this to my application, and it worked really well. So down below, the second one is an example of an actual test. And this test was simple. It's just beat up on the login page. So the first row has parameters. There are input parameters, like the browser, what browser is it running on, username, password, and then there's a click. Click is a decision parameter. Do I click it or not? And then there's expected parameters. So in this case, I'm expecting an error message to appear. So the first two iterations, rows 2 and 3, are simply, it's a negative test. Wrong username, wrong password. The third row, or I'm sorry, the fourth row, which is the third iteration of this particular test, is a successful login. So that changes the expected value. Goes over to say, here's the expected links. The expected links, and in this case, and if you recall previously, I mentioned that the back end needs to support the front end design. In this case, you can actually verify multiple links in one Excel cell simply by separating them via a tilde. So for every text, every string is expected, it looks for a link, returns a pass or fail condition for each independent link in between those tildes. So that's just kind of an example. It's worked well for us. Simple to put together. Manual testers can see each tab as a process, and there's all the variables I have up top that I can put data into. Been very successful.
So, Dean, actually, real quick, before we get to this next poll, I did want to mention we've had a few questions come in asking, I guess, some of the people that joined a little bit later. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of it via email within about 24 hours of the ending of this webinar. So I just wanted to let everybody know that who didn't catch that at the beginning. So now that we've gone over the different types of frameworks, let's take another poll. For those with an automation framework in place, how would you describe it? Is it business process, data-driven, keyword-driven, or a hybrid? So I'm going to let everybody have a chance to take the poll. I always feel like I should play the Jeopardy music during this, but maybe that's
Yeah.
just me.
It's in my head too, Brent. You're not alone.
I think it's in everybody's head. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Thank you again for everybody who participated in it. Dean, what do you think about the results?
Very cool. So as expected, the hybrid is the most common. It's 44%. Keyword driven is the lowest. I'm not sure what to think about that, but I'm glad that the business process and data are higher. Keyword driven, again, is much more granular, a little more challenging to design the scripts. If in fact you want to kind of put that into the hands of a manual tester to develop the automated test, keyword is a little more challenging in that regard. So no, very, very cool. That was really helpful and encouraging. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. All right, back to you, Dean.
Alrighty. So okay. So how do we do this? Now we know, the differences, what they are, pros and cons, things like that. How do we get this done? So the first thing, you have to choose what type of framework best suits your organization. And some of the key considerations, and the biggest one is always budget, right? Budget dictates the tools, dictates the resources, number of resources, the quality resources even, how long those resources can work on the framework and on the automation. So, budget rules. Hopefully, we all have some influence on that and can help kind of drive that budget where we feel as those on the ground, if you're an automation engineer or mid-manager trying to push the QA automation, we can hopefully sell the idea that a framework, properly developed framework automation design, will provide great value to the organization. Urgency is key. You may need to pick maybe not the best framework, but maybe the quickest one to develop, depending on how quickly you have to have it up and running, what's coming down the pipe as far as your project deadlines and things like that. Sometimes your test environment will drive, and we'll look at that in a little more in just a minute. We talked about the customer, and their level of expertise and comfort with developing automated scripts that can dictate the framework that you choose, and then some of the requirements. Let's drill down into just a few of these. So your test environment. If you're just automating against a couple web applications and there's not some JavaScript or some custom controls or some really challenging things to work with, then you'll have a much easier time choosing what type of framework to utilize. You don't have to account for multiple types of technologies. If you're just working on SAP, then probably a business process type of framework will work best for SAP simply because it's so well structured in and of itself, okay, as an example. How many applications are in scope? You may not have to think about, when I develop this framework, I have to think about different applications, along with technologies. I can just focus on this one application. In that case, again, business process is probably the simplest one to put together because you don't have to think about onboarding other applications into the framework. How about the execution environment? All right, are you working with physical machines? I don't see those too much anymore. It's usually some kind of hosted virtual environment that becomes the execution test bed or test bed, I guess, really, for machines to execute tests on. And then do you have to run tests on multiple machines simultaneously? And this is key, and here's why I mentioned this. You think, okay, that's a no-brainer. We have a test management tool that will help us do that. ALM, Quality Center, will assist you in that. Well, what if you don't have that? What if one of the requirements is you have 8 or 10 machines? We need to run these things as fast as possible. We don't want any downtime on these machines. So maybe you have a test set of 20 scripts, another test set of 55 scripts, and they're all going to each run on one machine. Well, then you have one machine sitting for some period of time while the other machine's pounding it away. And the reason I mentioned this, we came across a scenario exactly like this where we had to run multiple tests on multiple machines without the benefit of a test management tool. So within the framework, we built in a load balancing mechanism where the scripts or the framework actually knew what machines were currently running a test, what test it was running. As soon as that test was over, it would update a file, and we always had this function pinging this file, say what machine was available, what test is available, match them up, run them on that machine. It was a blast to do. I mean, it was pretty challenging, but as engineers, we really enjoyed putting that together. But it can change the structure of your framework and kind of putting in a tailspin if you're not careful. So that's just kind of one example. What are some of the requirements? So when it comes to reporting, what kind of level of reporting do you need? Does your automation tool have a built-in report mechanism already? Some do, some do not. Do you need a high-level summary? So if you're using a tool like ALM, HP's ALM to execute your test scripts, then in ALM there's already reports. You can actually pull high-level reports, all kinds of layers of reporting. But what if you don't have the benefit of that? So you have to build some of these reports within the framework. So an executive summary. Here's a test that ran. Here's ones that passed or failed. Maybe you want to add a criticality to it. So this one failed, but who cares? This one failed. Oh, it's a showstopper. That kind of thing. Certainly include detailed steps. As far as I'm concerned, test results aren't completed without screenshots, at least for failed conditions, because failed conditions, your failure point that says, oh, this object didn't exist, or this field was or this button was disabled, may not say the whole picture. There could be something happening in the environment. There could be a pop-up window in the way. A screenshot of the desktop will show you what's happening in the environment at that point in time in your application and in your whole environment, really. As far as the GUI side goes, we're talking about GUI stuff here. So that's important to build in. If you're working in a FDA-regulated environment, it's required to have screenshots for all pass and all fail conditions as objective evidence. Okay, so that's a requirement. Emails are great too. Build that into your automation. That can get crazy. Don't go crazy sending emails to everybody, but set some conditions for who gets what emails under what conditions and send them out so you know the status of what's going on. The data is also important to understand and how to handle data. So are you working with a reliable set of static data? That's heaven right there when it comes to automation. Or you can rely on the same set of data every time you run the test. Not generally the case. Does the data need to be created for each test cycle? Okay, because that data can be used up. Can you run a test multiple times in the same test cycle, or does that data get used up? Do you have a data refresh process for each test cycle, so you can start with the same, a static set of data in your environment? In many cases, we've had to utilize queries to pull data from a database into a test scenario or multiple scenarios, and that can be challenging too. Again, you may not, if the query isn't solid enough, you may not know what you're getting. So your framework has to be designed around those data requirements. What about the front end? So the front end is key to decide on first, all right? Before you start your back end, what are the scripts going to look like, all right? So the front end can be inside the automation tool. So maybe you don't have manual testers or BAs who have the bandwidth to help develop the automated scripts. So maybe all that part, even the front end, developing the scripts themselves, stay in the hands of the automation engineers. Okay, in that case, utilizing the automation tool would work fine. All right. Are you going to use Excel or database to build the scripts? It can be utilized. You can utilize a test management tool. I mentioned ALM, business process testing module in there. Then a little bit of training on that any kind of manual tester or non-technical person can create automated tests using BBT and ALM. What level of detail is required in the front end, in the script itself? So is it very technical? Do I need to understand what function calls are available, what procedure calls are available, what parameters are required for those procedure calls? That's very technical, all right? Can it be very detailed? Kind of, you know, between technical and little detail, there's a very detailed. So in between there, you may have to know the name of the object, the class of the object. Okay, slightly technical, not overly so. And a little bit of detail, you may just need to know what data. So in the example, the example we showed previously of the data set or the data table with the tabs and the process names, that hybrid framework, the processes are named, all you have to do is throw the data in. Okay, so you need to have a little detail, just need to know what data, what processes to put together in what order. Very simple to build. So that's the front end. What are the requirements there? So some of that is determined by who is your customer. All right. If it's you as the engineer, then you're on your own. You decide how to build these out. Who cares? But if you're hoping to leverage other resources in the organization for developing your automated scripts, you need to take them into consideration. How technical are they? I'm sure they know how to use Excel, but do they understand object classes and properties and those kinds of items when it comes to automation? Okay. Do they know the automation tool? Most manual testers don't want to see the tool. They don't want to do that. Give them Excel, we're good with that, but I don't want to be touching the tool. Here's something we learned kind of the hard way. What is their aptitude? Okay, just because they understand Excel and have maybe 20, 25 years of testing experience doesn't mean they can think abstractly enough to leverage Excel and apply rules and syntax to build an automated test. So what we started doing at Checkpoint Technologies is actually giving an aptitude test, an online aptitude test for applicants when we're looking for individuals to design the test automation or the automated scripts for a framework. And that gives us an idea of how flexible they are, how abstract thinkers they are. All right, so that's something you might want to consider as well. Are they fast learners? Do they want to learn? All right, some people don't want to learn. Some people have their desk the way they have it. I've been doing the same thing for years and years. Don't change my stuff, or I'll go up into a corner and curl up and suck my thumb, kind of thing. But I know no one knows anyone like that. But just saying, okay. But you know, a lot of people are resistant to learning something new. Okay, you got to work with those people sometimes, and they're great to work with. So that's the customer. So how do we plan the front end? Okay, it mostly depends on the type of framework. Okay, that structure is going to depend on the framework you're utilizing, and again, the customer. Once you make that decision and have all the key players help you make that decision, document the design rules. What are the rules around putting an automated script together using this front end? We're using tildes to separate expected values. To use carets that mean something. What are the names of the parameters? EXP means that's an expected value. It's not input. _out means an output parameter. Don't put something in the output parameter because it's just going to be overwritten. Been there, done that. All right, so naming conventions and things like that. Document those rules and then set time aside to train the script designers on those rules. And those scripts can start being developed while the framework is being developed. Okay, so keep that in mind too. You don't have to wait till the framework is done. If you're separating that front end from the back end, you can then have the script designer start developing the scripts while the framework is being developed. Done that multiple times, it works well. Then start scripting, just like I said. If design rules are followed and the code is properly done, the scripts will execute as planned. And we've done this multiple times. We'll have 100 or 150 automated test scripts ready, built in Excel. Once the framework is done, we can start running them. And that'll identify maybe some flaws in the framework that need to be modified. You know, maybe we need to build in a couple more rules. So there's a learning process there as well. And we've had instances where some tests just run completely through and we're all good and clean. And other ones that are more complex, we have to do little tweaks. The front end will dictate much of the back end design, of course. And then keep in mind, I think I mentioned this before, but very important, the simpler the front end, the more complex the back end, because you're handling many more variables in the back end if your front end is very simplistic. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If your front end is very technical, then you don't have to handle all that kind of stuff in the back end. You're just reading that file and doing what it says. But if not, then the back end needs to be very, very robust and make some decisions that maybe aren't evident in the front end. So planning the back end. So again, the back end is the working part of the framework. It is the code. It supports the front end design. All right. Typically, there's a driver script, and that's going to be likely the most complex part. It has to make a lot of decisions based on the incoming keywords, data, process names, things like that. You want that driver script to handle multiple iterations. Okay. You want that driver script and the other modules to handle the incoming data, processing the data. If you look down at the last bullet, how do we read the data? How's the data being generated by the application get read out and associated with the test file, with the front end file? And then how's that data shared as well? There's a lot of tests that are dependent upon data from the previous test run. How do you share that data from one test to another? Okay, that can be really challenging because you have these separate files that are living somewhere. You have to be able to associate the output from one file as input to another file. Okay, and there's methods we've utilized to do that I'm not covering here. There's details, but there are ways to do that as well. A test management tool can possibly help you do that as well. All right. So yeah, so I just kind of talked about this. Data sharing is key, and even though it's, I'll say this though, best case is tests are independent of other tests. That makes life easier. Not always real world. Many times you will need to share data from one test to another. How are the expected values managed in the framework? So when you have an expected value come in, then you have a mechanism to pull the actual value off, do a comparison, return or pass or fail, rate it out to the report. Everything's packaged inside of a function. All right. So that's the back end kind of data management side. So it's key to determine exactly what the driver script needs to do. All right, there's a list of things that I don't have here, but it's going to read the file, make decisions, branch the calls to different various modules, functions, whatever it happens to be. All right. There's going to be a number of function libraries to handle object-specific interactions. I should say object class-specific interactions, really. Buttons will be managed one way, edit fields will be managed another way, web tables will be managed another way. And those are separate functions to handle those object classes. You'll have a reporting function library that handles different levels of reporting. And the other thing I would put in there is determine in that reporting what's a critical fail and what's a general fail. So what you can actually do is when you run across a critical fail, you can have a mechanism that stops the test run. No reason to continue this test if that page didn't load, right? I mean, why bother? There's no objects to work with, something broke. Stop the test. So determine different levels of failure. Then of course there's the data management and the driver, and then error handling is key through via the function library. Some test tools will have essentially a wizard that helps you build in error handling. Some tools do not have this, so you have to kind of build the functions in to handle unexpected errors. And something that's really, really key is document and track the progress of your framework development, because you're going to have management watching you. And I learned this the hard way, I'll confess. Okay, in the past I haven't been the best at this, but now I am because I learned the hard way. But while you're developing this framework, there's not a whole lot of tangible evidence, not a lot of tangible stuff running tangible results. So if you have access to a test management tool, and everybody should have some test management tool, your framework structure can be put in as requirements and then assigned to different individuals to develop those pieces of the framework. All right, I got to move a little quicker here. If multiple applications are in scope, pick one. I would say pick the simplest one as a template or a pilot project, and develop your automation framework around that application. When it comes to resources, if you're not a lone wolf, hopefully you're not, leverage the experience and knowledge of your test team, assign them to different parts of the framework, leverage their knowledge of the application. If you're using a process driven type of framework, then the knowledge of AUT is critical and very, very valuable. So leverage the knowledge and experience of your test team and assign different parts of the framework to develop. Constantly communicate, always very important. It's a development project, right? For all intents and purposes. So treat it as such. And lastly, be very flexible. Things are going to change. Your best laid plans at the beginning may not work out just right. So those daily meetings the communication should be, here's what I'm running into, how can we resolve this issue? And so yeah, flexibility will keep you sane. All right. So one more thing I want to mention, which is I think can be valuable for those of you who have automation in place. Not every automation endeavor works out the way we plan. And I can't tell you how many organizations we've gone into where automation is years into development, years into execution, but just hasn't provided the standard that the company wanted, isn't providing the value, isn't robust and reliable as they would hope. What we've done in multiple cases, go in and just do an audit on the automation. Look for the areas of the framework that are lacking robustness, okay, for lack of a better term. Efficiencies to run the test. Error handling is critical. In one case, I found we're looking at test results, the application never opened up, and that test tried to run for 4 hours, but there was no critical failure that was identified to kill the test from running. So little things like that. It's much easier for someone coming in from outside the weeds, looking in and helping you finalize and get your test framework up and running to where you want it to be, so you can show the ROI that automation can promise. Okay. So with that, Brent, I'll hand it over to you, see if we have any more questions or time for questions.
Yeah, well, since we ran right up to the hour, I do want to mention on the test automation forensic audit that you just you talked about, there is a handout available for everybody that's in attendance. It's in the control panel. Please, if you want some more information on that offering, grab that handout. It goes into a little bit more detail. And again, since we're a little short on time, I'm just going to take a couple of questions. For one, I'm the only person developing automation on our QA team. How is it possible for me to develop a framework while still delivering on the day-to-day automation needs at hand?
Well, I hear North Korea has a great cloning program. You might want to talk to them to help you go, but no. No, seriously, but that is a tough situation, honestly. So, excuse me, I would recommend, if you're the lone wolf, or maybe just a couple of you and your heads down and just putting automated scripts out using a tool, take every advantage possible to break those components down or the lowest level into functions that can be used, leveraged in a framework. The other thing you might want to do is grab some information online. We can help you present an ROI, to present to your management. Here's the value of a well-written framework. Here's what we can get from it. So that's something you want to kind of do to try to sell the idea, and we can help you do that as well.
Great. Well, I'm gonna give you one more, and then with the closing slide. So, and maybe a shortened version of this, but what is the impact of not having a framework?
The impact of not having a framework is a lot of redundant work, It can be a lot of frustration, a lot of maintenance can occur. A framework provides standards for all your automated tests. All your automated tests runs through the same code, producing the same results, using the same error handling. And those standards are important, especially when it comes to onboarding other projects. So you know how it's going to behave, you know what's going to happen. If you just record playback or just some standard data driving scripts, when you onboard another project, you're starting from scratch. It's like starting all over again. A framework allows you to have a baseline of code and a structure to implement another project into the automation.
Great. Well, like I said at the beginning of the webinar, if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with the answers to those as soon as we can. So before we close out today, I just wanted to mention a few of Checkpoint Technologies' upcoming events. On April 13th, which is just a few weeks away, we'll be hosting another webinar similar to this, but this one titled Test More, Test Faster, Test Continuously, which is all about leveraging the power of technology to transform your test efforts into a lean, mean testing machine. Like I mentioned earlier in the webinar, we will be at the Quest Conference in Chicago in booth number 4, April 18th through the 22nd. Please come out and see us. And right after that, we'll be at the Star East Conference in Orlando, Florida. For registration or more information on any of those or any of our upcoming events, just visit our events page on our website at checkpointtech.com. I want to invite the audience to reach out to either one of us with any questions you may have or anything your organization may need assistance with. I'm going to leave our contact information up for just a few more minutes to allow anyone to take those down. I do encourage everyone here to take the very short survey at the end of this webinar, letting us know how we did, whether you'd like us to contact you in the next few days. So with that, on behalf of myself, Dean Carvin, Dean, thanks again for a fantastic job. And everyone here at Checkpoint Technologies, we hope you enjoyed our webinar and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all. Have a great day.